Cinema has shown itself to be transgressive in many ways, from violence, sex and gore to unconventional ways of presenting the world, as well as inspiring audiences to question their own moral compasses. In this video, I will be focusing on the horror genre and what it suggests about modern society. Horror as a genre is not exclusive to cinema, and it did not begin when films came into existence. The genre was particularly popular in the Victorian era, which saw people having a morbid fascination with all things ghostly and macabre. Literature and small-time publications such as penny dreadfuls from the era have given us some of our most memorable horror characters and stories to date, and many of them went on to be immortalised in film. Horror is often seen as the perfect genre for cinemas. There is a certain amount of anticipation when entering a darkened room, and few genres make such effective use of sound and visuals as horror does. Cinemas invoke a certain dreamlike state, and horror engages directly with our nightmares. Like going into a different realm, cinemas and horror are a world of shadowy suggestion and are effective forms of escapism. Terry Castle, an American literary scholar, suggests that these environments supernaturalize the mind, making ghostly illusions seem more real than ever before. However, one of the most important things about cinemas and movies is that the audience is aware of its fiction, and therefore the engagement with nightmares is only done from a safe distance. One of the most significant aspects of horror movies is what their iconic monsters represent. The 1925 silent classic, The Phantom of the Opera, sees the Phantom reveal his true nature that lurked beneath his mask. This suggests a certain morbid fascination from audiences, where people know they shouldn't look but do anyway, and often get more than what they bargained for. This characterises much of horror, the desire to look at something ugly or disturbing despite knowing it will be unpleasant. One of the most memorable icons of the horror genre is Frankenstein's monster. In a 1931 production, the monster is initially presented as childlike and gentle, who is eventually goaded into violence. The monster is the victim in this story and can easily be used as a metaphor for outsiders who face the daily scrutiny of normal people. In the 1957 adaptation, The Curse of Frankenstein, the Doctor is presented as being even more villainous than he was previously. Perhaps the purpose of the story is to elicit sympathy for those that are simply a product of a corrupt situation. The success of the Frankenstein movies may suggest how otherness and outsiders were truly scary themes at the time, as they suggest most people's desire to fit in and their intense fear of standing out. While indicative of the attitudes in the 1930s, Frankenstein and his monster have been reimagined year after year, all sharing the same core features. More modern adaptations tend to focus more heavily on Frankenstein himself as an outsider and as a tortured soul. A good example of this is the 2014 TV show Penny Dreadful, where Victor Frankenstein is still clearly an outsider who has committed atrocities, but the motivations behind his actions are a little more nuanced and are portrayed more as human weakness rather than outright monstrous behaviour. This suggests that the capability of our fellow humans as opposed to monsters is what is truly fear-inducing. This is particularly transgressive to present on screen, as it forces the audience to come to terms with how anybody can do awful things, regardless of their superficial qualities such as looks and origin. James Whale, the director of the 1931 version of Frankenstein and later The Bride of Frankenstein, played heavily on this fear of otherness. Whale was an openly gay man, and for the 1930s this was a pretty significant way to stand out. His work demonstrates this, particularly in The Bride of Frankenstein with the introduction of Pretorius, a classically camp character with undeniable homosexual undertones. Film historian Vito Russo suggests that Pretorius is a figure of seduction and temptation. This coincides with the contemporary view of homosexuality as predatory and gay men as individuals who entrap people and ruin their otherwise pure and natural lives. If homosexuality were to be represented on screen, it would only be done under the guise of villainy. Another instance in which otherness is used as a driving force of fear is Todd Browning's 1932 film Freaks. The film used actual carnival performers who were initially, like Frankenstein, presented sympathetically, but ended up being shown as squirming, crawling and predatory. Dehumanization of people with physical and mental disabilities in 1930s America was prevalent. The tagline of Freaks demonstrates this fairly well. Can a full-grown woman truly love a midget? The suggestion that people with disabilities and physical differences were somewhat unlovable indicates why they elicited such morbid fascination and fear from audiences. This is the same decade which John Steinbeck's novel Of Mice and Men was released, which is a classic example of contemporary attitudes to disabilities. Freaks was a spectacle to be watched from a distance but not to be integrated with the rest of society. Asylums and inhumane institutions saw to this issue, segregating the others from the rest of us. The fact that these were real people and not some person with makeup on makes this film a particularly disturbing indication of social attitudes and ethics, or lack thereof, in 1930s America. It would not be expected today as we have greater understanding of physical and mental disabilities. However, shows like American Horror Story suggest otherwise. In the 4th season of the show, both real and prosthetic physical disabilities were displayed, in the same circus setting as Freaks. While many would argue that the aim was to empower those with disabilities, I believe that they were still presented as something for audiences to gawk at. Their difference was still the driving plot point, and many of their mental and physical differences were presented as shocking and horror-inducing. Even in the 21st century, people still find disabled people entertaining to look at and see them as separate from normal society. These films highlight the intense anxiety of being seen as an outsider. What many horror films utilise, including the ones explored in this video, is the uncanny. Freud elaborated on this idea extensively, stating that the uncanny is that class of frightening which leads back to what is known of old and long familiar. Freud suggests that the uncanny arises from the ways in which the unfamiliar impacts upon the understanding and acceptance of the familiar. The duality between the familiar and the unfamiliar is a common motif in horror movies. When a monster resembles many of the qualities of ordinary humans but has something about them slightly off, audiences feel very creeped out. For example, Frankenstein's monster looks mostly like a human, but his pallid skin colour, misshapen head and unblinking eyes suggest something sinister. Frankenstein's monster is not entirely unhuman looking, but he is not familiar enough to not be disturbing. Horror writers have used this concept for centuries to create suspense in two major ways, by creating humanity where it shouldn't be and removing humanity from where it should be. This explains why many of us find something unnerving about human-like creatures or creations, such as the human-chicken hybrid in Freaks, classic hybrids such as the Minotaur in Greek mythology, or clowns. Clowns have been used in horror for decades and are a perfect example of the uncanny, as their makeup is supposed to be friendly and child-oriented, but they usually end up looking beyond human with their exaggerated eyes and wide smiles.
What a nice pony. Do you want it back?
Yes, please.
You look like a nice boy. Do you want a balloon too, Georgie?
I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers.
Oh, well, I'm Pennywise, the dancing clown. Now we aren't strangers, are we?
To summarise, many horror films would not be what they are without their iconic monsters. These monsters represent a deep fear inside us all of being seen as outsiders, even when we may secretly feel like one. While many argue that we celebrate differences far more in recent decades, it is undeniable that monsters and the uncanny are still a very important fixture of many horror films, and very rarely are they presented in a sympathetic or liberating way. The monster represents the core belief in society that otherness and being an outsider is somewhat transgressive, and not being part of the crowd is a source of fear for many. We see much of ourselves in these monsters, and that That is what makes them truly fearful and transgressive.